All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this lecture, another lecture in the Extreme Beliefs lecture series. I think we're a nice little group today in the room and online. But before I introduce our speaker for today, let me say a word on the next lecture so that I won't forget it. That one is by Daniel Keuler on the 25th of June, and it's going to take place in Utrecht. So check out the website for that one. I think the announcement is already online, and you can already register for that one. And you can attend either physically or online, as with this lecture. All right. Then I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jeanine Roy van Zuijdewijn. She's an assistant professor at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. She has a background in liberal arts and the sciences and history of international relations, and completed a PhD on responses to terrorism. That was back in 2021.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And her research interests are therefore responses to terrorism, the impact of terrorism on societies, foreign fighters, and lone actor terrorism. She's published various peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and reports also on these topics. She serves as the associate editor for Perspectives on Terrorism, one of the leading journals in the field, and is also part of the editorial board of Leiden University Press. One of her core publications I brought along, and you brought along as well. Let me show it here. Yeah, good, it shows up. So this is a wonderful book, The Aftermath of Societal and Political Responses to Jihadist Terrorism, that came out last year with Oxford University Press. And what you're going to share with us today is very much related to this material. So terrific to have you. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Let me stand somewhere here. So yeah, the people at home can see. Can people at home hear me properly as well? Just to check. Maybe someone can put a thumbs up to show.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Good.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Great to see people online and in the room on a nice sunny day here. So what I would like to present today is indeed some of the main findings and some of the empirical data of my book on societal and political responses to jihadist terrorism. And what I would like to do is first start with say a few words about why it is important to study response to terrorism. And then I will zoom in on the concept of meaning making, which is one of the core concepts that I used in my book, and reflect on some of the main findings and lessons for counterterrorism. And if I'm correct, we have also time for Q&A after the presentation. If there are any pressing questions or something is unclear, feel free to raise it in between, but otherwise, let's leave the questions for the end. So if we look at the essence of terrorism, so already in the 1970s, there were famous, well-known terrorism scholars like Brian Jenkins who said, well, terrorism is not just about killing. It's not only about the violence, but you could say it's a violent communication process. So terrorists use attacks to affect audiences to reach certain political or ideological goals. So he said that terrorists actually want a lot of people watching, not necessarily a lot of people dead. Yeah?
Can I make photos of the presentation?
Yeah, you can take pictures, but I think it will also be in the recording, but you can take, right? This will be shown, but feel free to take pictures. Yeah. So he said it's about attracting a large audience. So it's a violent communication process. And attacks in that sense are means to an end. So if we want to understand the impact of terrorism on societies, if we want to know why terrorism can affect us, we also need to look at what happens afterwards. But in terrorism studies in general, I found it quite, surprising that most scholars actually focus a lot on the terrorists themselves, rightly so, right? So they have a large body of literature and understanding who they are, why they do what they do. And this is very important and very valid research. But I noticed there was kind of a lack of attention to more these responses or our own role as societies or politicians in how we deal with it. So I also tried to fill in a bit of this gap in the field of terrorism studies that I started to focus more on what happens after these attacks take place. So if we start from this this kind of assumption that terrorism is about impact, it's about responses, about audiences. This also has effects for how we see counterterrorism. And if you ask people who work in the field of counterterrorism professionals, they would say, well, counterterrorism is stopping the terrorists or preventing them from attacking, or maybe prosecuting them when something happens. And again, this is a very important, even a core part of counterterrorism, because if we would be able to prevent all terrorist attacks, we wouldn't need to be able to respond to it. So of course, this is a clear priority. But again, here, you could also say, well, countering terrorism also means countering that mechanism of terrorists wanting to achieve impact, wanting to affect certain audiences. So you can say countering terrorists is the terrorists themselves, the actors or the organizations, is primarily the domain of professionals, so military, police, intelligence, etc. But the good news is that actually countering the mechanism of terrorism, so countering this impact, this increased fear, is actually something that we can all do in society, and that we all, this is a kind of a normative point of view, but that we all should do, I think. So it's citizens, it's communities, the media have a big role, of course, in either increasing the impact of terrorism or trying to limit it. And also, of course, of professionals, because also in counterterrorism strategies, if you look at these, often the 5 Ps or the Dutch approach, you also see that responding, of course, is also a core part of classical counterterrorism. But so I started from these 2 pillars. So counterterrorism is also countering that mechanism.
Mm.
So what I try to do in my book, in my work, is focus on how society responded to jihadist terrorist attacks. My initial idea was actually to study more broadly the impact of terrorism, but quite soon I recognized that it's really hard to actually, in a scientifically proper way, establish what is really the impact of an attack, because then you need to be able to establish causal mechanism, and well, in social sciences it's really difficult. So my first idea was, okay, what is the impact? But I realized, well, impact is really, I found it too problematic myself to be able to study that. So I changed it to something that is more active, that we can actually see, that we can actually collect empirical data on, which is the meaning-making process. So how societies responded to jihadist terrorist attacks. And I focused both on the authorities and the citizens. And here I try to combine insights both from more the side of public administration or political sciences that focus traditionally more on, of course, the authorities, people with power, politicians, etc. And the field of sociology, cultural anthropology, symbolic politics. Well, that's more also the politicians, by the way, but to see also what it does with communities, with citizens, how they perform certain rituals, symbols. So I try to combine, come to a more interdisciplinary approach actually of looking at these responses to these attacks. So it's an interdisciplinary study focusing on 2 actor groups and on 3 main concepts, frames. So what people say, of course, and what they write. So the written or verbal discourse, I should say, and rituals and symbols, what they do also, demonstrations, commemorations, etc. And here I also used insights from the field of crisis management, because meaning making, I will go in depth a little bit more in a second, but meaning making is a concept that is also often mentioned by well-known crisis management scholars like Arjen Boyn, Eric Stern, Paul Hartbank, Fidelis, etc., who say, well, leaders have 5 core tasks when they are faced with a crisis. So the first task is, of course, sense making. And this is really getting the basic facts straight. So let's say there is a truck that drove into a Christmas market, like one of my case studies in Berlin. Then sense making is, of course, well, what happened? Is it one truck? How many people are killed? How many ambulances do we need to send? Is the driver already in custody, or has he died, or should we still find that person? So it's really getting the basic facts straight of what is the situation. Well, based on this initial assessment of the facts, of course, you take certain decisions. So if you think it's just a traffic accident, then you won't declare a state of emergency for a whole country, because it's a limited issue that you think is already, the hot phase of the incident has already passed, so to say. But if it's a terrorist attack, you think, or if, well, terrorist attacks are already meaning making, but if you know it's on purpose and the driver is on the run, you would take different decisions. And then the phase after that is meaning making. And this is more, for instance, if you think of President George W. Bush after 9/11, his famous speech, why do they hate us? He said this about Al-Qaeda. Why do they hate us? And he said, well, he knew the answer. They hate us because they hate our liberal values. They hate our way of life. So this is doing something more than just saying planes crashed into the World Trade Center, which is sense making. We have planes that crash into the towers, they collapsed. But meaning making is people do this, a certain group of people has been doing this because they hate our liberal way of life. So that's meaning making. Or President Hollande after the attacks in Paris who said France is at war. So this is clearly a step beyond just stating the facts, but it's an interpretation and it puts it in a certain framework. Because if you speak of war or if you speak about a battle against liberal values, you will also, of course, then take certain measures or have certain responses that align with that frame. So it has an impact. It's not just words, but it has an impact also on what follows next. Well, hopefully, or in crisis management, of course, they say a crisis will be terminated at some point and you will hopefully learn from it. So this is also some insights from that discipline. And then a few more words about meaning making more broadly, because it's a term in crisis management. It's a term that can be very applied to real world cases. But of course, we just had a very brief discussion about this before. It's a universal concept and it's a core element of human experience. I'm also curious to hear more from experts here in the field with a more philosophical or theological background. It's not my background, but to hear more what you think of this later on, maybe. It's a core element of human experience. So you can say, well, meaning making and the ability to reflect upon your existence is what actually distinguishes people from animals. Because we are the only species that can actually, for instance, end up in an existential crisis and think, why am I on Earth? What am I doing here? And so we can reflect upon our own existence. And that's actually, you can say, it's what makes us humans. Yeah? It's that we can engage and that we must engage in meaning making. Also, if we do not engage in meaning making, we cannot find meaning in life, then indeed we do end up often in very existential crises and have all kinds of psychological issues. So it's a crucial element that we also need to do to survive the realities of every day and everything that happens to us. And a book that maybe some of you have read or heard about, I hope, is Viktor Frankl's book about his experience in the concentration camps in Second World War, where he wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning. He said, well, even if you're in the most horrible circumstances, there's still ways to find meaning in your life. So it's a very inspiring book. So again, this is just to show it's not just a concept from crisis management or political science, but it's actually a very key element of human experience that is used in many different fields. Mm-hmm. But of course, and that's why I used it here, it's very important, I would say, after terrorist attacks. Because terrorist attacks, you can say, kind of destabilize the social order or the social contract between the state and its citizens. So the state needs to protect its citizens, need to be able to deliver security, and a terrorist attack is a clear breach of that social contract, because apparently the state wasn't able to deliver this security. So you need to also engage in meaning making to show why has it happened, what will we do about this, and also for the people involved, of course. So I looked at 4 attacks in Western Europe, and I chose 4 jihadist attacks around the time of 2016, 2017. First, I was also thinking maybe I should pick cases with different ideological backgrounds, but in the end, I decided on purpose to pick 4 jihadist attacks in Western Europe to at least make the cases to some extent similar or comparable, because I look at differences in meaning making. So if I would then compare or have jihadist attacks, extreme right wing, etc., then it would be very hard to see what comes from the attacks already, what comes from the responses. So I picked 4. To some extent, of course, every case is different, but to some extent, similar attacks in a similar cultural space, and also very practically, because I wanted to study these frames and these rituals and symbols, I had to be able to read the languages and translate it. So in these countries, at least, I could do that. And I don't speak. I speak some languages, but not all languages across the world, unfortunately. So that also limits my case selection a bit. So I picked these 4 Western European cases. In Brussels, the attack on the airport, Zaventem, and the metro in Maalbeek. In Nice, where a truck drove in on the boulevard of 14 Juillet during the national fireworks show, national holiday. Berlin, so the Christmas market attack, and the attack in Manchester on the concert of Ariana Grande. And that was, in particular, a number of young children died because she was quite famous also with a younger group of fans. So these 4 different jihadist attacks. And I zoomed in on the first year after these attacks. And actually, I zoomed in on 3 different periods. So first, I picked the first day. And the first day is really more in line with the crisis management literature. So kind of the golden hour after terrorist attacks. So the immediate response. Was it framed as terrorism? Was it framed as something else? Who was the first one to use that word? So really zooming in on this first initial crisis response kind of phase, the first day. Then I looked at the first week. Initially, I thought, okay, maybe let's focus on the first 2 weeks. But after I studied the case of Brussels, I saw that already quite quickly after 1 week, the main frames and the main meaning making kind of, it wasn't frozen, but it kind of was already distilled in some of the main frames that you would then also see for the rest of the year. So for the first week, and then I fast forwarded to the first anniversary of these attacks, because I also wanted to look in particular at how are these attacks commemorated. So for all of these 4 cases, I went to the cities a year later to attend these first anniversary events, to attend the official commemoration events, but also to speak to people on the streets to see, okay, if we zoom out a little bit longer, as a historian, a year is nothing, but in the field of security studies and political science, a year is already quite a bit. So if you look a year later, what has changed? Or maybe nothing has changed, but has something changed in how people speak about the attack, the frames that are used as compared to the initial week after the attack? It's kind of to try to see history in the making. You live in the period yourself, but try to see how our interpretations, how they change over time. And I also here, by the way, I used literature from, for instance, how commemorations of the Second World War changed, or other kind of conflicts, because they also change over time. Think of the 4th of May discussion in the Netherlands. What do we commemorate on the 4th of May, etc. So these things are not set in stone, they evolve over time. So for these 4 cases, and now I will show you some examples of the empirical data of the cases, but I zoomed in on this first year and on these 2 different actor groups. So now to present you some of the findings of the cases, and then I will come to the main conclusions and the implications. So in the case of Brussels, so this is the attack on the metro and on Zaventem, on the airport. Interestingly, the main frame there was, it was no surprise. This was March 2016. There had already been attacks in other countries, mainly, of course, for Belgium, importantly, the Paris attacks the year before. So the main frame was, well, in Europe, we knew there was a clear and growing jihadist threat. This was also, of course, the years when a lot of people went to Syria to fight there and to join jihadist groups. So they said it's no surprise, it could have happened anywhere. Unfortunately, it happened in Belgium, kind of. The response was rather fragmented. So there wasn't one clear frame or response, but this, of course, also has to do with the structure in Belgium, with the 3 regions, the different languages, the divisions in the country. And quite soon there was a blame, there were all kind of blame games, like who was responsible for, because some of these terrorists were already on watch lists. Why could they have gone to Brussels? Why was nothing done to stop them? But also, I will show you in a second, blame games around the responses. And at some point, hooligans came to Brussels. I will explain it in a second, but also blame games about the polarization that occurred in society afterwards. So the king played an important role during the commemoration, and also, I guess, because the king is a more politically neutral figure in Belgium who can connect the different groups, the different regions, the different languages. So you saw that he clearly played a role there. 2 ministers also offered their resignation in response to the attack, but were asked by the prime minister to stay on to actually deal with the security situation. But you saw it led to a lot of political pressure and tensions afterwards. If we look at what the citizens did, we see that the Burgplein, so one of the main squares in Brussels, emerged, and they literally call this a citizen commemoration site. So many of the official commemorations were not open to the wider public. And you saw there was a clear wish or desire by citizens to also do something themselves and to come to a central square, to join together and to organize their own events. So a lot of people wrote messages with chalk on the pavements, on the Burgplein, flowers. Here you see different religious communities that were present. But less positive, I would say, is something that happened around the March Against Fear. So the week before Easter, because the attack was the week before Easter, there was a March Against Fear that was organized to show, okay, we are not afraid, we are resilient. But then the authorities realized or came to the conclusion that the threat picture was too dangerous. So they actually had to cancel the March Against Fear out of fear of another attack. So you can imagine that for some people, this was kind of a disappointment that a March Against Fear is canceled out of fear of more terrorism. But people were asked to stay at home and not come to the Burgplein. But then a number of hooligans, quite a number of hooligans from the north of Belgium, of Flanders, came to Brussels to the Burgplein because they still wanted to show we are not stopped, we won't be stopped by terrorists. So they were very angry, like why can terrorists now kind of have an effect on us society so that we cannot go to this square anymore. So they came to the Burgplein, and then there was this also tension with the police. They destroyed the memorial, not on purpose, but there was so much trouble going on there. So in the end, the Burgplein, the memorial was all trampled. Police had to use water cannons, etc. So it wasn't really a good example, I would say, of resilience. But interestingly, I will come back to this in the end. It also shows what happens if you don't give citizens the space to do something. So I don't want to just say, okay, all these people were to blame. I'm not putting any normative judgment on that, but it shows that they wanted to do something, they weren't able to do something, and then this happens. Very different case was Nice. So this was on the boulevard where the truck drove in, where a lot of people were killed during the fireworks show. And after this attack, the main frame by President Hollande was France is at war with Islamic State. And of course, he had said this before, also after the Paris attack. So to understand this case in Nice, you have to realize, of course, that this was the third major attack. There were more attacks before, of course, but there were two big attacks in Paris the year before, Charlie Hebdo and the November 2015 attacks. And this happened in July 2016. So a lot of people were fed up and saying, why did this happen again? Yeah, and Hollande said, well, it's because there's a larger war between France and the Islamic State. So it was a clear emphasis not on the European problem. So he didn't refer, and the authorities more broadly, not just Hollande, but there weren't many references to a pan-European threat. And Belgium, they said, well, this is a pan-European problem, and we are now the ones who face it. But in France is at war with the Islamic State, and that's why we are confronted with this. Many state-led commemoration efforts, you see it on the picture, there was little room for initiatives by citizens, but citizens could participate. So there were all these signs also a year later with Hommage Participatif, where people could join in. So they did think about how citizens could be included, but there wasn't a lot of room for citizens themselves to come up with their own responses or own rituals, I should say. There was an important role for the victim organization. And again, this also has to do with the history of France. France has more, unfortunately, more experience with terrorism than, for instance, Belgium. So you see that victim organizations were already quite organized before the attack took place. And they also played an important role after this attack. So they also had their own monuments. And they also could have meetings with some politicians. So you see they had some political influence as well. well, I said this before a little bit, but there was also polarization and discussion about the role of the state. So when Prime Minister Valls came to Nice a week after the attack to commemorate, a lot of people were booing and yelling because they felt like, why has the French state not been able to protect us from another jihadist attack? So in the literature, political science, you have this rally around the flag effect that you probably have heard of, where people in a moment of crisis actually join, or there's more strong support for the leaders of the state. But in this case, there was no rally around the flag. The authorities were waving with the flag, but citizens weren't really rallying around the flag because they felt like it happened again. And then at some point, the rally around the flag effect doesn't work anymore, you could say. It clearly worked after worked is maybe too, how do you say it, like it's opportunistic, but there was a rally around the flag after the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the November Paris attacks, but not this time. In Berlin, it was very much focused around the church, or the Gedächtniskirche. And the attack took place on the Christmas market on Breitscheidplatz, where this church is also situated. And you saw that kind of the pastor of this church, Martin Germer, also spoke to him, stepped in, also because the authorities, these are not his words, by the way, but my interpretation. It's not his words, my interpretation, but he stepped in because there weren't many official commemoration events that were organized. But people felt a clear need to still go there, do something. So he also organized some services in the church. He was present a lot of times on the square to talk to people. And the official commemoration was already so quickly after the attack that many of the families of the victims didn't even realize they were family of the victims, because many people were not even identified yet. So a lot of family and relatives later on were quite disappointed and angry because they didn't even have the opportunity to attend, because they didn't realize they were the ones also affected by it. So a year later, they also on purpose tried to organize another service where the families and the relatives could join. But again, so interestingly, in all these cases, already a little bit of conclusions, you see different figures stepping in, different organizations, different role of the state, depending to some extent on the cultural background, on the situation or the location of the attack. And also if there's no one doing anything, people like the pastor will probably step in to play an important role. Also in Berlin, there were many protests and demonstrations. And these are some pictures that most of them I took, only not the Identitaire Beweging, you can see with their logo, but during the first anniversary of the attack. So I was in the Gedächtniskirche on Breitscheidplatz attending the official commemoration. And while I was in the church, I heard a lot of noise and screaming and sounds outside. So I was like, okay, I also need to look what's happening outside. So after the service, I went there and I saw there were 4 or 5, I think in total, it were 5 different demonstrations going on around the moment of the official commemoration, ranging from far left to far right, or even extreme right. If you ask the German, well, they are not allowed to use that label anymore, so maybe I should also not use it, far right groups and far left groups. So all kind of different groups, and also more centrist groups, by the way. But they all recognized that this was their moment to try to influence the meaning-making process. So they were demonstrating either, this is on the bottom left, you see a makeshift coffin that certain demonstrators made to show, well, these are Merkel's deaths. She's responsible for the people who were killed. So Merkel's blood on her hands. So they put this coffin like she's responsible. So really trying to put the blame on the German government. But others were demonstrating with slogans, our solidarity against hatred. So they were kind of protesting against what they saw as the hatred of the far right groups. And also Antifa came to, again, try to counter the far right protests. So you see that all these different groups try to put their own interpretation on what happened. Also here on the bottom right, you see a picture of a makeshift monument that was put in front of the Brandenburger Tor without any permission. It was by the Identitaire Beweging, who said for the victims of Islamist terrorism, because the official monument on Breitscheidplatz only said for the victims of terrorism. And they felt, well, this is politically correct. we need to be clear about who is responsible. They said Islam is terrorist, so we have to put that on the monument. So they made their own monument and put it there. The monument was quickly removed because there was no permit for it, and then they were quite angry that they had no opportunity to do that. But of course, you're just not simply allowed to erect all kind of monuments, especially not in front of the major tourist site in Berlin. But again, it shows how these groups use these places and these moments, again, all groups from all sides, to try to affect the meaning-making process. In Manchester, there was a memorial service in one of the main churches. You see the prince, what's his official title? The Duke of, well, I'm not really good in these royal titles. It's in my book, it's probably correct.
Prince of Wales, right?
Prince of Wales, yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah. I should know this. Can we cut this out for the recording? The Prince of Wales, memorial service in church. A clear role here for the city of Manchester. So in France, it was more the state. It was Hollande, it was the French fighter jets with the flags. But here was more the city of Manchester. You see the mayor walking around. And well, the official commemoration was not open to the wider public because not everyone could fit into this church. But they very smartly erected all these screens outside of the church and handed out these leaflets. I was also sitting outside on the grass, and I got this booklet with all the text of the speeches, with all the names of the speakers. So they thought about, okay, we have an official service that might not be open for everyone, but we are thinking of how to still include the people who cannot be physically in that church. Many volunteers all wearing these yellow t-shirts, the Manchester Bee, a symbol of the city. And this was a clear example of cooperation between authorities and citizens in how they were commemorating it a year later. So many local initiatives, and actually you could say a lack of a political message. So there was no speech, for instance, in Manchester by Theresa May, who was then the Prime Minister. It was really more focused on these local forums. Pride and resilience, people were all posing and smiling for pictures. The Manchester Bee, I Love Manchester. And also in the evening, a concert, a festival, One Love Manchester, where people came together to sing all these songs that had a link to the city. Which Manchester is well known for all kind of bands like Oasis, the Smiths, Elbow, etc., who come from that area or the city. Also, I guess because the attack was on a concert, so you also see that the symbols they use and the rituals align with the context of the attack and the response as well.
Just before you move on that point, because I used to live around that area, but I came around that area right after the attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Was there? Because Manchester is also known to be a place for working class people. Do you see some of that there? Was it like more like a working class response? This idea, because usually the posh Manchesterians are not. I love Manchester.
Yeah.
You know, that's more like a working class.
Yeah.
Did you see any of that?
Interesting. Well, I did see a lot of references to the industrial past of Manchester. Okay. So Manchester was once was a very important industrial city in the UK, and well, is now a poorer city actually. A lot of industry has gone, and many of the references also by citizens were like, we are Mancunians, we are known to dealing with hardship, and we can deal with this as well. And also this working class, the workers' bee, so the bee of the textile industry of Manchester was a well-known textile hub in Europe. So this workers' bee of working hard, not complaining. If something goes wrong, we can deal with it, we can overcome. And that was, I guess, more linked to the working class, I would say that, and other groups in society. Yeah, good point. Yeah. So I think that was about Manchester. So then some of my main findings. So again, I was a limited time, so if you're interested, you can always read the book to get more details. And it's hard to summarize. It was a bit of a challenge for me also. You have 4 cases, 4 widely different countries. You look at a year after these attacks. How do you summarize this? Or how do you analyze it even? But I somehow still managed to arrive at some main findings. And I looked at both the overall forms of meaning making, so the ritual symbols phrase, how they evolved, the dynamics over time, the cooperation between citizens and authorities. So these were some of the main analytical tools that I used kind of to organize my results. The first finding was that the terrorists actually were quickly pushed off stage. And I here refer back, of course, to the theater metaphor of that also Beatrice de Graaf is using a lot and Brian Jenkins in the past. So terrorists want this attention, they want to be on the stage, they want to affect the audiences. But if we look at what happens in the aftermath of the attacks, quite quickly, it wasn't about the terrorists anymore. It was about which minister was responsible, or it was about hooligans that came to a certain place, or it was about the pride and resilience of Manchester, an industrial city known to dealing with hardship. So it wasn't a lot about the terrorists or their motives. So they were quite quickly pushed off the stage. So the meaning making was about a lot of things, but not so much about the terrorists themselves. Secondly, I saw a mix of, you could say, well choreographed performances and chaotic stage fights. So in some countries, you could see that there was a coordinated campaign to halt it was again in the UK, to halt the election campaigns for a few days, but then also to restart altogether, with the exception of one party that restarted before the rest did. But they coordinated it in response to the attack, but also many blame games, state fights, who was responsible again. So it wasn't an overall picture of rally around the flag or only polarization, etc., but it was a mix of this. And also in terms of solidarity and polarization, I also looked at online trending hashtags. I didn't have time to go into that in this presentation, but what happens on social or on Twitter in particular. Back then, Twitter was often used. Now it's a bit less used by the wider public, to express myself diplomatically, but back then it was used by a wider group of people. So I also looked at these online, trending hashtags and varying degrees of solidarity and polarization. Fourthly, the importance of these spotlight moments and prime locations. And this was kind of something I really didn't think about before. So the first three I was thinking about a little bit before, at least to look at it. But this surprised me quite a bit, that I found like, whoa, in all these cases, you really see that citizens and authorities use certain moments and also certain locations. And you could say they maybe want to reclaim the public space from the terrorists again. So terrorists managed to, in these cases, attack so-called soft targets, so targets that are not highly protected. And you see that they want to go to a certain square and say, well, we stand here and we are not accepting terrorism in our countries, etc. Or they go to the square, there you see the church, the Gedächtniskirche in Berlin. They want to go next to the church because they know the church is where it's happening. So they really want to go to these prime locations at these prime moments, kind of to claim the public space, claim it back from the terrorists again. And the last finding, which also surprised me quite a bit, is that citizens showed restraints in their responses more frequently than the authorities did. So if you look at the extent to which people copied the frames of the terrorists, of being at war, etc., of a big ideological, civilizational battle, it were often the politicians, the authorities, the government that was copying that rhetoric, and not the citizens. And this was interesting for me also because in the field of crisis management or public administration, or if you speak to people in positions of authority, they are often a bit afraid that citizens might overreact and there will be a lot of polarization. But actually, it's more often the group themselves, these actors themselves, that have an effect on this than citizens do. I can maybe say a bit more about that in the discussion as well later on. So what are the lessons for counterterrorism? Well, first, and I need to explain this a bit more because I didn't show it in my cases so far, but the first is that authorities need to, in counterterrorism, we need to be prepared to balance goals, juxtaposing goals that, and so goals that might be opposing that could lead to policy dilemmas. So I put a picture here of the Christmas market in Berlin to illustrate this. So after a terrorist attack, there's different things you want to do. So on the one hand, you want to show that something very tragic has happened. something very abnormal has happened, right? It's not a daily, hopefully, at least in Western Europe, not a daily thing that's happening. So you want to mark the abnormality of the event. You want to mourn. You want to show how sad, how tragic it is. But on the other hand, you also want to show resilience. You want to show it's not really affecting your society as much, because you want to show to the terrorists, well, you can do this, but you cannot really change our society.
Mhm.
So the case of the Christmas market, how long do you close the Christmas markets? And do you keep it closed? Of course, first you need to close it to deal with the direct impacts, and of course with the victims, etc. But do you open it very quickly as soon as possible to show, well, we're back in business, well, we continue our traditional Christmas markets, or do you keep it closed out of respect for the victims and the families, or maybe because you think there's still a danger? So how do you deal with these dilemmas? So there were many different examples of these dilemmas that authorities maybe weren't really prepared to deal with, or didn't really think them through. And of course, you cannot, you cannot predict all of them, but some of them you can predict, like these ones, marking abnormality versus showing resilience. How do you do that? Pay more attention to the symbolic dimensions of the response. In particular here, I mean also how to deal with victims and their families, because in many of these cases, you saw that victims and their relatives were not very happy with how they were helped, how they were dealt with in the aftermath of these attacks. For instance, again in Berlin, that Angela Merkel didn't visit the victims in hospital. A year later, she apologized for this and she explained why. She said, well, I didn't think I could do anything because someone had lost a leg. I'm not a doctor. I cannot help this person. So I don't see a role for myself to go there because this person is hurt, etc. And she didn't realize back then how important it was as a public leader to be there, to show your sympathy. And many of the victims said, well, we were victims kind of for Germany or for German society, right? So it wasn't about us. It's about a bigger thing. It's about the country or maybe even Western Europe. So we need to be recognized as victims of terrorism, as victims of something more broader than just ourselves being targeted. So how do you deal with victims? That was something that I saw in most of the cases was still, could warrant more attention from the authorities. Increased cooperation between authorities and citizens in organizing the responses. So in many of the cases, you saw that the different rituals, commemorations were very separate. Whereas in the case of Manchester, I think you could see clear cooperation between citizen initiatives and authorities. And that really helped well to also realize what are the main identity markers of a city, what are rituals and symbols that fit well with the population. And for instance, indeed, again, the workers' city, the workers' class. So from these groups in society, we can get a lot of information about what would be good responses or good ways of meaning making that align with that group. So increase that cooperation and don't just do it top down as a government or a city council, but speak to the people who actually live there. And be cognizant of the risk of copying the terrorist frames. And this is again what I said about, for instance, in France, France is at war, an existential battle between good and evil. This is my personal opinion, of course. This is more the policy recommendation that I've myself formulated. But I think we should be careful there because we know that terrorists want to have a large impact. They often want overreactions. So I think counterterrorism also needs to include some kind of mitigation of the impact by not copying too much the rhetoric of the terrorists. Of course, without ignoring what has happened. So I don't say we should not pay any attention or not talk about it or not talk about the ideological background of the attackers. I think we need to do that. Again, it's my personal opinion. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but the words we use, the frames we use, can have a huge impact on the impact, actually. So my final slide. So if we go back to one of the first slides that I showed about the essence of terrorism, terrorists want to affect audiences, terrorism as theater, and countering terrorism or counterterrorism as both countering the actors, but also countering the mechanism, then one of my main concluding remarks is also that we need to be, or we need to enable individuals and communities to play a role in countering that mechanism, and also to increase their self-efficacy, so their ability to respond to the attack, to feel they are somehow in control of their responses, etc. And from many of the cases, I saw good examples of how communities and citizens knew very well how to respond by, of course, paying a tribute and homage to the victims, also acknowledging what has happened, so not ignoring it, but mainly also emphasizing solidarity and links between different groups, and not overreacting or increasing polarization.
What's with B, or the was?
Yeah, the Manchester Workers' Bee. So again, it's the symbol of the city. And when I was there when I took this picture, there was also a mother who came to me because she saw I was making notes. She asked, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm a researcher." Oh, come. My daughter has just set a new Manchester Bee tattoo, and the pants of the daughter on the bottom leg had to be shown where she had the Manchester Bee tattooed. So, and the tattoo shops used this money for the victim organization. So they collected money to donate. But people were very proud, and they were all thousands of bee tattoos. If you now go to Manchester, you'll find thousands of people with a bee tattoo. That they actually got after the attack to collect money for the victims. So a very nice symbol, I think, and showing again self-efficacy. I mean, it's not really directly lowering the impact of the attack, but it is showing that people can do something, and that they collect money for the victims, etc. And again, also showing them their local identity, feeling a sense of pride in where they are from. So I think that's a good example where these different things actually come together. Okay, thank you. I think that's the end of the lecture.